For most people today, the Ottoman Empire is a shape on a map they once squinted at in school, usually colored in some muted shade of beige or light brown. It appears, expands, and disappears in a few textbook pages, wedged between things that seem louder and more urgent. But for the people who lived inside it, it was not a dramatic arc. It was a long administrative experience. It was paperwork, routines, inherited jobs, and streets that looked the same every morning. It lasted for centuries not because it rushed anywhere, but because it kept going. Slowly, patiently, adjusting just enough to remain familiar. And while emperors came and went, most people were busy with much smaller concerns, like taxes, bread, and whether tomorrow would look exactly like today. Which most of the time it did. Before we drift any further, if you enjoy these long, quiet history journeys, you can subscribe to the channel. And if you feel like it, leave a comment with your city and the time you're listening. It's always quietly interesting to see where these stories end up. Chapter 1. A Bedtime Empire begins. Now, as Chapter 1 settles in, this is the moment to get comfortable. Maybe adjust a pillow. Maybe pull a blanket a little higher. Nothing important is about to happen quickly. The lights can be low. The room can be quiet. The Ottoman Empire will still be there when you open your eyes again. It waited centuries already. The story usually begins at the end of something else. That's how empires tend to introduce themselves. The late 13th century was not especially tidy in Anatolia. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had already weakened, fractured by Mongol pressure and internal confusion. Authority existed, but lightly. Power was scattered across small frontier territories, each ruled by a local leader who was important mostly to the people living very close to him. These were borderlands, where certainty was rare and permanence was aspirational. One of these local leaders was Osman, son of Ertugrul. Of course he was. History likes neat lineages, even when reality was probably messier. Osman was a minor frontier lord, or bey, with a modest following. He ruled a small territory near the Byzantine frontier, which meant opportunity but also inconvenience. Borders, especially soft ones, are places where things drift. People drift. Loyalties drift. Authority drifts too. Osman's early life is mostly a blur of legend, because the people writing about him later needed him to be impressive in hindsight. But at the time, he was one local leader among many, dealing with raids, alliances, and the daily need to keep his followers fed and moderately loyal. He was not founding an empire yet. He was managing a household that happened to include armed men. Life in these early Ottoman territories was quiet in an unromantic way. Villages rose early. Animals needed attention regardless of political circumstances. Fields were plowed because fields always need plowing. The presence of a new ruler rarely changed the rhythm of a farmer's day. Taxes might be paid to someone else now. That was about it. Osman's authority grew slowly, which is to say, at a human pace. Small victories mattered not because they were dramatic, but because they were cumulative. A village here, a fort there, a few more families agreeing that this arrangement was acceptable. The Ottoman state did not arrive fully formed. It accumulated like dust. When Osman died around 1324, his territory passed to his son, Orhan. This is where things begin to feel slightly more official. Orhan took the small, flexible leadership he inherited and nudged it towards something more organized. He captured the city of Bursa, which mattered less for its symbolism and more for its infrastructure. Cities are useful. They have walls, markets, administrators, and people who know how to keep records. Empires need all of these, even if they pretend not to at first. Bursa became the first Ottoman capital. Capitals sound grand. In reality, it was a place where people argued over rents, traded goods, and complained about prices. But it also allowed the Ottomans to shift from purely frontier raiding to governance. That meant systems. And systems meant jobs. A quiet army of scribes began to appear. Men who could read and write became valuable in ways that did not involve swords. They recorded land grants, tax obligations, and legal decisions. These records were not written for posterity. They were written so that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to remain manageable. Orhan also introduced coinage bearing his name, which was a small but important step. Money has a calming effect on authority. It makes rule feel routine rather than personal. When people pay taxes with coins instead of favors, power becomes abstract. Abstract power lasts longer. Meanwhile, daily life remained stubbornly ordinary. Most people were not thinking about dynasties. They were thinking about weather. Anatolian winters were not forgiving. Houses were simple. Heating was inefficient. Families gathered around small sources of warmth and talked about practical things. Marriages were arranged. Children were expected to contribute early. Nobody was waiting for history to notice them. The Ottomans expanded gradually into Byzantine territory, which by this point was a patchwork of fortified towns separated by countryside that often governed itself. When a town changed hands, the biggest concern for its residents was whether taxes would increase and whether local customs would be tolerated. The Ottomans were generally pragmatic. Keeping things familiar reduced resistance. Familiarity was cheaper than force. This habit of adaptation became a defining feature. Conquered populations were not usually uprooted. Instead, they were absorbed. Christians remained Christians. Jews remained Jews. They paid different taxes, followed their own religious laws in many personal matters, and largely continued their routines. The empire did not demand uniformity. It demanded predictability. By the time Murad I came to power in the mid-14th century, the Ottomans were no longer a small frontier group. They controlled significant territory in both Anatolia and the Balkans. Murad spent much of his reign traveling. Not in a glamorous way. He moved because governance required presence. Courts were mobile. Decisions were made wherever the ruler happened to be sitting that week. Murad also oversaw the early development of the Janissaries, though at this stage they were not yet the polished institution they would become. The idea was simple and quietly unsettling. Christian boys were taken, converted to Islam, educated, and trained for state service. For the families involved, this was not a dramatic kidnapping scene. It was an administrative process. Notices were given. Records were kept. Life adjusted. Some of these boys became soldiers. Others became bureaucrats. Many lived lives defined by obedience and routine. They woke early. They trained. They studied. They waited for instructions. The state shaped them carefully and in return expected loyalty. It was not personal. It was structural. Murad died on the battlefield in 1389 during the Battle of Kosovo. This fact is often emphasized, but the aftermath was less dramatic than one might expect. The empire did not collapse. Succession happened. Life went on. Farmers planted crops the next season. Markets reopened. Grief was private. Bayezid I, his successor, moved faster than his predecessors. He expanded aggressively, earning the nickname the Thunderbolt. This was not entirely helpful in the long term. Rapid expansion strained systems. Administration lags behind ambition. But for a while it worked. Then came Timur. And this is where the Ottoman story pauses, stumbles, and very nearly ends. Timur's defeat of Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara in 1402 shattered Ottoman authority. Bayezid was captured. The empire fractured. Sons fought sons. Provinces drifted away. For a moment, it seemed like the Ottomans would be remembered as a regional experiment that briefly went too far. For ordinary people, this period was confusing rather than catastrophic. Authority changed hands again. Taxes were demanded by different men. Loyalty was uncertain. But villages still existed. Fields still needed tending. The collapse of an empire is often experienced as a series of administrative inconveniences. The interregnum lasted over a decade. Eventually, Mehmed I emerged as the sole ruler. His greatest achievement was not conquest, but repair. He reassembled the state patiently. He restored institutions. He reassured elites. He made the empire boring again. This was necessary. By the time his son Murad II took power, the Ottomans were once again stable. Expansion resumed, but cautiously. Treaties mattered. Administration mattered more. The empire had learned that speed was not always its friend. Chapter 2. The empire learns how to sit still. By the early 15th century, the Ottoman state had reached a point where simply surviving felt like an accomplishment. After the confusion of the interregnum, there was a shared understanding among the ruling elite that too much excitement was bad for continuity. Expansion would continue, yes, but with paperwork. Preferably lots of paperwork, the kind that slows everyone down just enough to think twice. Murad too ruled in this spirit. He fought when necessary, negotiated when possible, and spent a surprising amount of time dealing with internal order. This meant confirming land grants, resolving disputes between local governors, and reminding people who technically worked for him that they still worked for him. Authority at this scale needed regular maintenance. In the countryside, life remained predictably repetitive. Peasants lived in small villages, usually tied to land that had been worked by the same families for generations. Crops varied by region, but wheat and barley were dependable constants. The agricultural calendar mattered more than any imperial decree. Sowing, tending, harvesting, and resting formed the backbone of the year. Taxes were assessed based on this rhythm, not against it. The state learned quickly that ignoring seasons led to resistance. Resistance was inefficient. Tax collection itself was a quiet profession. Collectors traveled familiar routes, carrying ledgers rather than weapons. Their presence was expected. Resented, perhaps, but expected. Negotiation was common. Bad harvests were explained. Promises were made. Payments were adjusted. The empire preferred steady income over short-term pressure. In towns, artisans organized themselves into guilds. These were not revolutionary institutions. They were conservative by design. A guild regulated who could practice a trade, how goods were made, and what prices were acceptable. Innovation happened slowly, and only after agreement. Stability mattered more than brilliance. A cobbler who produced the same reliable shoes for 40 years was more valuable than one with ideas. Markets opened early and closed early. Goods were displayed without urgency. Buyers and sellers knew each other. Bargaining followed scripts learned in childhood. The outcome was rarely surprising. A transaction that ended exactly as expected was considered a success. Meanwhile, the Ottoman court continued to formalize itself. Ceremonies grew more elaborate, not to inspire awe, but to establish order. Who stood where mattered. Who spoke first mattered. Clothing signaled rank. These rituals reduced ambiguity. Ambiguity caused disputes. Disputes wasted time. The devshirm system expanded during this period, becoming a regular feature of imperial administration. Christian boys were selected at intervals, assessed for physical and mental suitability, and sent away for training. For the state, this produced officials whose loyalty was direct and uncomplicated. For the families involved, it was a strange mixture of loss and opportunity. Some boys never returned. Others rose to positions of quiet influence. Either way, life adjusted. These boys learned discipline above all else. Days were structured. Silence was encouraged. Obedience was routine. Education emphasized practical knowledge. Languages, accounting, law. Emotional expression was not a priority. A good servant of the state was calm, reliable, and forgettable. Murad too abdicated briefly, then returned to power, then abdicated again. This indecision confused contemporaries and delights historians. It suggests fatigue. Ruling an empire was not glamorous. It involved endless petitions, complaints, and compromises. Eventually, Murad settled into retirement, leaving the throne to his son, Mehmed. Mehmed too inherited a functioning state. That was its own burden. He was young, ambitious, and surrounded by advisors who had seen what happened when ambition ran ahead of structure. They encouraged patience. Mehmed listened, sometimes. Constantinople remained the obvious prize. The Byzantine capital had endured centuries of decline, but its symbolic value remained high. It sat there, inconveniently, between Ottoman territories. For decades, it had been tolerated, contained, and gradually encircled. Everyone knew it would eventually fall. There was no rush, or so it seemed. Preparations for the conquest were methodical. Fortresses were built. Roads were improved. Cannons were cast, tested, and adjusted. Supplies were stockpiled. Nothing was left to chance, mostly because chance complicated accounting. When the city finally fell in 1453, the event was undeniably significant. But even here, the aftermath was quieter than expected. Looting was limited. Administration resumed quickly. Mehmed wanted a capital, not a ruin. Constantinople became Istanbul, slowly and deliberately. Repopulation was encouraged. Muslims, Christians, and Jews were invited or compelled to settle there. Neighborhoods formed along familiar lines. Religious institutions reopened. Markets resumed. The city's grandeur was rebuilt not overnight, but over decades. Stone by stone. Ledger entry by ledger entry. Mehmed styled himself as a universal ruler, but his daily concerns remained practical. He issued laws regulating everything from land tenure to street maintenance. He cared about water supply. He cared about grain prices. He cared about whether officials showed up when they were supposed to. The palace became a center of controlled routine. Servants followed strict schedules. Silence was valued. Access to the Sultan was limited and mediated. Power flowed through channels, not conversations. This reduced unpredictability. It also made the system resilient. For ordinary residents of Istanbul, life was a series of small adjustments. New taxes replaced old ones. New officials replaced familiar faces. But bread was still baked in the morning. Water was still carried from fountains. Children still learned trades from their parents. Empires changed. Days did not. Beyond the capital, the empire expanded into the Balkans and Anatolia with similar pragmatism. Local elites were co-opted. Land was redistributed through the Mimar system, which tied military service to agricultural revenue. This system discouraged absentee landlords and encouraged stability. A cavalryman depended on the productivity of his assigned land. He had an interest in keeping peasants alive and reasonably content. Timar holders lived modestly. They collected taxes, maintained equipment, and waited to be summoned. Much of their time was spent not fighting, but overseeing harvests and resolving disputes. Their authority was local and limited. This suited the empire. As Mehmed aged, his conquest slowed. Administration took precedence. Laws were codified. Precedents were recorded. The empire learned to refer to itself. This is an important moment in any long-lived system. When Mehmed died in 1481, succession was again managed with a mix of decisiveness and restraint. Bayezid II emerged as ruler. He was less aggressive than his father, more interested in consolidation. This disappointed some. It relieved many. Bayezid's reign was marked by stability. He supported scholars, patronized religious institutions, and avoided unnecessary wars. He allowed Spain's expelled Jews to settle in Ottoman lands, not out of sentiment, but practicality. They brought skills, networks, and taxes. This was considered a good arrangement. Under Bayezid, the empire settled into a rhythm. Expansion paused. Administration deepened. The state became something people could plan their lives around. This was perhaps its greatest achievement. Chapter 3, where expansion becomes a habit. By the time the 16th century arrived, the Ottoman Empire had developed a strong sense of itself. It knew how to govern. It knew how to tax. It knew how to wait. What it also knew, by now, was that expansion had become a kind of expectation, not a frantic one. More like a regular chore that appeared on the calendar every few years and was dealt with accordingly. Bayezid II's later years were calm enough to feel almost idle, which unsettled parts of the ruling class. An empire that stops moving can start to feel unsure of its purpose. His son Selim did not share this concern. Selim preferred motion. He was decisive in ways that made administrators nervous but generals attentive. When Selim took power in 1512, it happened quickly and without much ceremony. Bayezid stepped aside. This was presented as orderly, though it involved the quiet removal of alternatives. Succession in the Ottoman world was efficient, not gentle. Once resolved, however, it allowed the state to proceed without lingering debate. Selim's reign was brief, but densely packed. He turned the empire's attention eastward, confronting the Safavid state. This was framed in religious terms. But at ground level it was about borders, routes, and influence. Armies marched. Supplies followed. Local populations watched from fields and doorways, trying to determine which side would be collecting taxes next year. The campaigns were successful. Territories in eastern Anatolia and beyond were absorbed. The details mattered more than the battles. Governors were appointed. Tax systems were adjusted. Existing elites were either incorporated or replaced. The empire did not reinvent these regions. It reorganized them. Selim then moved south toward the Mamluk Sultanate. Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina came under Ottoman control. This elevated the Sultan's religious standing, but it also dramatically increased administrative responsibility. Managing pilgrimage routes, grain shipments, and water supplies became imperial concerns. For people living in these newly acquired lands, the transition was familiar. New rulers arrived. Decrees were issued. Local practices were largely preserved. The Ottomans preferred continuity to disruption. It kept things quiet. Selim died in 1520, leaving behind an empire that had expanded significantly but was still intact. His son, Suleiman, inherited this structure. Suleiman would later be called the Magnificent, though this says more about European observers than about his daily life. He was also known as the Lawgiver, which is more accurate and far less exciting. Suleiman's reign was long. This alone made it influential. Long reigns allow systems to settle. Suleiman ruled for nearly half a century, and during that time, the empire reached a kind of administrative maturity. Expansion continued, but at a measured pace. Hungary became a contested zone, gradually drawn into Ottoman control. The Balkans were consolidated. In the Mediterranean, the Ottoman navy became a presence, not flashy, but persistent. Ports were taken, supplied, and managed. Life aboard an Ottoman galley was repetitive and uncomfortable. Rowers followed strict schedules. Food was simple. Discipline was constant. Days blended together. Naval power was built on endurance rather than drama. On land, soldiers experienced long periods of waiting punctuated by brief action. Campaigns involved marching, camping, repairing equipment, and negotiating with locals. Fighting, when it happened, was often anticlimactic compared to the preparation. Back in the capital, the imperial bureaucracy expanded. Offices multiplied. Titles became more specific. Records became thicker. Decisions took longer, which was considered a sign of seriousness. Judges, known as qadis, were central figures in everyday life. They resolved disputes, certified transactions, and interpreted law. Their courts were local, accessible, and busy. Most cases involved debts, inheritance, or minor disagreements. Justice was procedural rather than dramatic. Suleiman took a particular interest in law. He issued legal codes that clarified taxation, land rights, and criminal penalties. These did not replace religious law but complemented it. The goal was consistency. People could tolerate many things, but inconsistency caused frustration. The palace during Suleiman's time was highly structured. Schedules governed everything. Meals, audiences, ceremonies all followed established patterns. Servants learned to move quietly and efficiently. Mistakes were discouraged. Excellence was defined as invisibility. The harem, often misunderstood, was less a place of indulgence and more an institution. It educated women who might bear future rulers. It managed succession indirectly. It followed rules. Like everything else, it operated on routine. For women outside the palace, life varied widely. Urban women often participated in commerce, owning property, and engaging in trade. Rural women worked alongside men in fields and households. Their labor was essential and largely unrecorded. Religious life continued without much interference. Mosques structured the day. Prayer times marked hours. Festivals were observed. The empire accommodated diversity by regulating it. Differences were allowed within limits. As Suleiman aged, governance became heavier. Decisions accumulated. Advisors grew cautious. The empire's size made responsiveness difficult. This was not collapse. It was weight. When Suleiman died in 1566, he left behind an empire that was vast, orderly, and deeply institutionalized. His successors would inherit not just territory, but expectation. The system he presided over was stable, but also inflexible. Chapter 4. The Weight of Inheritance. By the late 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had reached a size that made every decision slightly heavier than it used to be. Not heavier in a dramatic sense. Heavier in the way large objects are heavy. They do not move easily. They require planning. They resist sudden change. Suleiman's successors inherited a system that worked, which is often more difficult than inheriting one that does not. A broken system invites innovation. A functional one encourages preservation. The new sultans were expected to maintain balance rather than redefine it. Selim too was not especially interested in personal leadership. This was not immediately disastrous. The empire had enough momentum to carry itself forward. Advisors advised. Officials administered. Armies existed whether or not the ruler personally inspected them. The state did not require constant attention, only periodic acknowledgement. The imperial council, the Divan, became increasingly important. Viziers discussed policy, reviewed petitions, and waited for decisions that were sometimes delayed. Waiting was a skill. Files accumulated. Ink dried. Problems aged quietly before being addressed. In the provinces, governors focused on maintaining order. Their duties were repetitive. They supervised tax collection, oversaw local courts, and communicated with the capital through formal correspondence. Messages traveled slowly. This encouraged local discretion. It also encouraged patience. The Timar system continued to structure rural life. Cavalrymen received land revenue in exchange for service. Over time, however, some Timars became hereditary in practice, if not in law. Families settled into predictable roles. This stability was comfortable but gradually reduced flexibility. Peasants lived under layered authority. Village elders mediated disputes. Timar holders enforced obligations. Judges provided legal resolution when needed. Most conflicts were resolved before reaching higher levels. The system preferred silence to escalation. In cities, life was shaped by routines that rarely changed. Shops opened at familiar hours. Prayer calls marked time. Guild rules regulated production. A baker baked what bakers had always baked. Customers expected the same bread tomorrow. Education was limited but functional. Religious schools taught reading, writing, and law. Students memorized texts, copied manuscripts, and learned to recite with precision. Originality was not discouraged exactly, but it was not rewarded either. The Janissaries, once tightly disciplined, began to change. Service became less isolated. Marriage was permitted. Urban connections formed. Janissaries opened shops, joined guilds, and developed interests beyond the barracks. This made them more integrated and less predictable. From the perspective of daily life, this integration was reassuring. Soldiers who lived among civilians were easier to understand. From the perspective of central authority, it was concerning. Loyalty diffused when identities multiplied. Court life grew more ceremonial. Access to the Sultan became increasingly restricted. Decisions were filtered through layers of protocol. This reduced impulsiveness. It also reduced responsiveness. Complaints sometimes waited years for resolution. Women in the palace gained influence through proximity rather than position. Mothers of sultans, in particular, became significant figures. Their involvement was not formalized, but it was consistent. Power followed relationships. Relationships followed routine. Outside the palace, women continued to manage households, businesses, and property. Court records show them buying, selling, lending, and litigating. Their lives were active, but rarely narrated. They existed in margins. The empire's borders remained mostly stable during this period. Occasional wars occurred, but they did not fundamentally alter the map. Negotiation became as important as conquest. Treaties were written, revised, and archived. European states were changing. Military technology evolved. Bureaucracies expanded. Trade networks shifted. The Ottomans observed these developments with interest but limited urgency. The empire was still functioning. That seemed sufficient. Trade continued to flow through Ottoman territory. Caravans moved goods across familiar routes. Inns provided shelter. Merchants calculated risks based on experience rather than speculation. Commerce rewarded patience. In coastal cities, sailors followed seasonal patterns. Ships departed when winds allowed. Cargoes were loaded methodically. Delays were expected. A journey that arrived eventually was considered successful. The 17th century approached without announcement. There was no sense of entering decline. There was simply continuation. Systems persisted. Habits deepened. Sultans came and went more frequently now. Shorter reigns disrupted continuity at the top, but not below. Officials remained. Records endured. The empire functioned despite uncertainty. Succession became more regulated, though not more humane. Potential rivals were confined rather than executed. This reduced immediate violence but created other problems. Isolated princes emerged with limited experience and cautious temperaments. When they ruled, they relied heavily on advisors. This was efficient. It was also constraining. Innovation was filtered through precedent. The capital grew crowded. Istanbul absorbed migrants seeking work. Housing filled. Neighborhoods expanded. Infrastructure strained quietly. Repairs lagged behind use. Water systems required constant attention. Aqueducts were maintained. Fountains were cleaned. Water carriers followed routes that had existed for generations. Their work was essential and monotonous. Food supply was a perpetual concern. Grain shipments were monitored. Prices were regulated. Shortages caused unrest. The state intervened quickly to restore calm. Hunger was disruptive. Religious institutions provided continuity. Mosques served as centers of community. Sermons emphasized order and obedience. Faith reinforced routine. The empire's diversity remained one of its defining features. Languages varied. Customs differed. The state managed difference through categorization. Communities were known, recorded, and taxed accordingly. Chapter 5. When continuity becomes the goal. By the early 17th century, the Ottoman Empire had entered a phase where the primary ambition was not growth, but continuity. This was not announced. There were no speeches about it. It simply became clear through behavior. Decisions favored preservation. Risks were minimized. The empire wanted tomorrow to resemble today closely enough that nobody panicked. The sultans of this period were often young, sometimes inexperienced, and frequently cautious. This was partly structural. Princes were no longer sent to govern provinces as apprentices. Instead, they were kept within the palace, isolated in carefully managed quarters. This reduced civil wars. It also produced rulers who were unfamiliar with the world beyond walls and corridors. When such a ruler took the throne, governance leaned heavily on advisors. Grand viziers became central figures, managing daily affairs with professional seriousness. Their authority was real but conditional. They served at the pleasure of the sultan, who might be distant but was never irrelevant. Court life became increasingly inward-looking. Rituals multiplied. Protocols thickened. Movement through palace spaces followed precise rules. Even silence was regulated. These practices reinforced hierarchy, but they also slowed decision-making. Slowness, at this stage, was acceptable. Beyond the palace, the empire was busy with maintenance. Roads needed repair. Bridges required inspection. Caravanserais needed roofs replaced. These were not glamorous tasks, but they enabled trade and communication. Without them, the empire would fray. Provincial officials continued their work with a mixture of routine and improvisation. Orders from the capital arrived late. Conditions on the ground changed faster than instructions. Governors exercised judgment quietly, hoping their decisions would align with expectations that had not been clearly stated. Taxation remained the state's most consistent interaction with its subjects. Registers were updated. Assessments were revised. Complaints were filed. Sometimes they were resolved. Sometimes they waited. Peasant life remained physically demanding and administratively predictable. Families rose before sunrise. Fields were worked by hand. Tools were simple and familiar. Harvest outcomes depended on weather more than policy. When harvests were good, taxes were paid with less resistance. When they were bad, negotiations followed familiar patterns. Village elders played an important role. They mediated between the state and the people. They explained obligations. They conveyed grievances. Their authority was informal but respected. The empire relied on these intermediaries to reduce friction. Urban life had its own rhythms. Cities like Istanbul, Edirne, Damascus, and Cairo were dense with activity, but not urgency. Craftsmen worked steadily. Apprentices learned by repetition. Shops closed for prayers and reopened afterward. Time was segmented by custom rather than clocks. Coffee houses became more common during this period. They were places of conversation, not rebellion. Men gathered to talk, listen, and sit for long periods. Stories circulated. Opinions were exchanged. Authorities watched these spaces with mild concern but generally allowed them to exist. Suppressing them caused more trouble than tolerance. The janissaries continued to evolve. Their integration into urban life deepened. Many no longer saw themselves primarily as soldiers. They had families, businesses, and local ties. This made them stakeholders in stability. It also made them resistant to reforms that threatened their position. Military campaigns still occurred, but they were more cautious. Logistics dominated planning. Supply lines mattered more than heroics. Armies moved deliberately. Battles were not sought unless necessary. Victory was defined as manageable outcomes. The empire's relationship with Europe became more complex. Diplomacy intensified. Permanent embassies were established. Information flowed both ways. The Ottomans observed European developments with interest, occasionally adopting practices that seemed useful. Printing presses appeared slowly and unevenly. Manuscript culture remained dominant. Copyists continued their work, reproducing texts by hand. This was labor-intensive but familiar. Familiarity reduced anxiety. Education remained focused on established texts. Scholars debated interpretations rather than innovations. This produced consistency. It also limited adaptation. The system valued mastery over novelty. Religious authority reinforced social order. Sermons emphasized patience, obedience, and acceptance of one's place. These messages resonated with lived experience. Most people did not expect change. They expected continuity. Natural disasters occurred, as they always do. Fires swept through neighborhoods. Earthquakes damaged buildings. Floods disrupted agriculture. The state responded with relief measures when possible. Reconstruction was slow. People rebuilt because they had to. The bureaucracy grew heavier. More officials meant more coordination. Coordination required communication. Communication required time. Time slowed everything down. Corruption existed, but it was rarely dramatic. It took the form of small favors, delayed enforcement, and negotiated outcomes. Everyone understood this. The system accommodated it quietly. The empire's diversity continued to shape daily life. Religious communities managed their own affairs under imperial oversight. This reduced administrative burden. It also reinforced separation. Coexistence was functional rather than intimate. Trade routes shifted gradually as global patterns changed. The Ottomans adjusted without urgency. They had land, people, and institutions. They did not feel cornered. As the century progressed, signs of strain appeared, but they were subtle. Revenues fluctuated. Military effectiveness varied. Administrative coherence required effort. None of this suggested collapse. It suggested aging. The state responded by issuing reforms that clarified existing practices rather than transforming them. Adjustments were incremental. Large changes felt risky. For ordinary people, these shifts were barely noticeable. Life continued as it had. Children learned trades. Families married. Old people told stories about how things used to be, which sounded very much like how things still were. The empire's greatest strength during this period was its ability to absorb minor shocks without dramatic reaction. Problems were managed, not solved. Solutions were temporary, not permanent. By the end of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was still vast, still functioning, and still familiar to those living within it. Familiarity was its anchor. It prevented panic. It discouraged ambition. It allowed sleep. Chapter 6. Adjustments made quietly. By the time the late 17th century settled in, the Ottoman Empire had become deeply accustomed to its own weight. The question was no longer whether it could function, but how much effort it would take to keep everything moving in the same familiar direction. The answer, increasingly, was more effort than before, applied carefully and without announcing itself. Military organization received particular attention, not because of panic, but because comparison had become unavoidable. European armies were changing in structure and training. The Ottomans noticed this the way one notices a neighbor renovating their house. With mild curiosity and a note of concern, campaigns were reviewed, equipment was inspected, fortifications were repaired, manuals were updated. These were technical tasks handled by specialists. There was no grand narrative of reform, just small changes layered over existing habits. The Janissaries, by now a complex social group, reacted cautiously. Any suggestion of reform raised questions about pay, privileges, and position. Negotiation followed. Compromise was reached. Nothing moved quickly. Provincial military forces, often more flexible, continued to handle local security. They knew the terrain. They knew the people. Their authority was practical rather than symbolic. The empire relied on them heavily. Financial administration became a central concern. Revenue collection was scrutinized more closely. Tax farming expanded, allowing the state to secure income up front. This shifted burden to intermediaries, who then managed relationships with taxpayers. It was efficient, if uneven. For villagers, tax farmers were more visible than distant officials. They were negotiated with, argued with, and sometimes avoided. Relationships developed. These arrangements were informal but durable. Urban finances followed similar patterns. Market taxes, customs duties, and fees were collected systematically. Records were kept. Audits occurred occasionally. The goal was predictability. The capital itself required constant maintenance. Fires remained a regular hazard. Wooden buildings burned easily. After each fire, rebuilding followed familiar patterns. Streets were cleared. Structures rose again. Life resumed. Public works continued. Bridges were repaired. Roads were patched. Fountains were cleaned. These tasks were assigned, supervised, and completed without ceremony. Their success was measured by absence of complaint. Healthcare was basic but present. Hospitals provided care to the poor and travelers. Treatments were conservative. Recovery was slow. Death was accepted as part of life. There was little expectation of cure, more of comfort. Food supply remained a daily concern. The state monitored grain flows into cities. Price controls were enforced during shortages. Enforcement was flexible. Strictness varied with circumstance. In rural areas, subsistence remained the norm. Families produced what they needed, supplemented by local exchange. Cash circulated unevenly. Barter persisted. This reduced dependence on distant markets. Education continued in religious schools. Curriculum remained stable. Teachers emphasized memorization and interpretation. Students progressed at their own pace. Advancement depended on persistence rather than brilliance. Intellectual life was steady rather than dynamic. Scholars corresponded, commented on texts, and debated fine points. Innovation was incremental. Respect for tradition guided discourse. Religious practice remained central to social organization. Festivals punctuated the year. Fasts were observed. Charity was encouraged. These practices provided structure and meaning. Non-Muslim communities continued to manage internal affairs. Their leaders coordinated with imperial authorities. Taxes were collected. Disputes were resolved internally when possible. This arrangement minimized conflict. Trade networks adjusted gradually to global shifts. Some routes declined. Others adapted. Merchants followed opportunity quietly. Losses were absorbed. Gains were modest. In coastal regions, maritime activity continued. Shipbuilding yards operated steadily. Craftsmen specialized in repetitive tasks. Ships were repaired more often than replaced. Longevity was valued. The empire's diplomatic presence in Europe expanded. Envoys reported back on customs, technologies, and politics. Their reports were read, discussed, and filed. Action followed selectively. Language within administration became more formalized. Templates were used. Phrases repeated. This standardized communication. It also drained emotion from correspondence. Court politics continued beneath the surface. Alliances formed and dissolved. Favor shifted. Careers advanced or stalled. These movements were quiet and procedural. Succession remained a sensitive issue. Princes were still confined. Education was controlled. Expectations were managed. When transitions occurred, they were handled efficiently, if not gently. The empire's legal system continued to function. Courts remained busy. Most cases were resolved locally. Appeals existed but were rare. People preferred closure to escalation. Daily life for most subjects was shaped by these systems without direct awareness. They lived within frameworks they did not design. They adapted. They endured. Chapter 7. Familiar Problems, Familiar Solutions. By the early 18th century, the Ottoman Empire had grown very good at recognizing its own problems. This did not always mean it was eager to solve them in new ways. Recognition often led to repetition. If a solution had worked once, it was likely to be tried again, even if conditions had shifted slightly. Administrative reforms continued in small doses. New regulations clarified old practices. Titles were adjusted. Salaries were revised. None of this altered the basic structure. It simply reinforced it. The central government relied increasingly on written communication. Orders traveled as documents. Responses returned as documents. Delays were expected. The rhythm of governance matched the pace of couriers and clerks. Provincial administration varied by region. Some areas were tightly controlled. Others operated with considerable autonomy. This unevenness was accepted. Uniformity was not considered essential. Compliance was. Local notables, often wealthy landholders or merchants, gained influence. They mediated between state and society. Their cooperation ensured stability. In return, they enjoyed recognition and flexibility. This arrangement reduced administrative burden. For ordinary people, these notables were the face of authority. They resolved disputes, organized tax collection, and represented community interests. Their power was personal and familiar. Military organization remained under review. Training methods were discussed. Equipment was compared. Changes were introduced slowly. Resistance was managed through negotiation. Janissaries continued to balance military identity with civilian life. Their presence in cities was visible but normalized. They participated in commerce, family life, and local politics. This blurred boundaries. Urban neighborhoods maintained strong identities. Residents knew each other. Mutual aid was common. Problems were addressed collectively before reaching officials. This reduced pressure on courts. Housing remained modest. Wooden structures dominated. Repairs were frequent. Ownership was often shared among extended families. Privacy was limited. Familiarity was unavoidable. Public spaces were functional. Bathhouses provided hygiene and social interaction. Their routines were well established. Attendance followed patterns of work and rest. Water distribution remained a logistical concern. Fountains were maintained. Access was regulated. Water carriers served households. Their routes were predictable. Food markets operated under supervision. Inspectors monitored quality and prices. Enforcement varied. The goal was balance rather than perfection. Agricultural life remained dependent on climate. Droughts and floods caused hardship. The state responded with tax relief when possible. Aid was uneven but appreciated. Religious institutions continued to anchor communities. Mosques, churches, and synagogues organized daily life. Their calendars structured time. Rituals provided continuity. Education remained conservative. Students progressed through established curricula. Advancement depended on mastery of accepted knowledge. Original thought was secondary. Intellectual exchange with Europe increased modestly. Translations appeared. Ideas circulated. Adoption was selective. Compatibility mattered. Art and architecture continued within traditional forms. New buildings echoed old styles. Innovation was subtle. Continuity was valued. Trade adapted to changing conditions. Merchants diversified. Routes shifted. Risk was managed through experience. The empire's borders remained largely stable. Conflicts occurred but were contained. Diplomacy balanced military action. Succession continued to be managed cautiously. Transitions were planned. Surprises were minimized. Daily life continued with little reference to imperial debates. People worked, rested, and adapted. The empire was present but distant. Chapter 8. The Slow Drift of Time. By the mid-18th century, the Ottoman Empire had settled into a kind of persistent inertia. It was not stagnant, exactly, but it moved with a deliberate slowness that made it almost imperceptible from day to day. Policies were issued, taxes collected, disputes resolved, all in ways that were quietly repetitive and predictably uneven. Nothing demanded immediate attention unless it threatened routine, and even then, responses were measured rather than dramatic. The sultans of this period were often less personally engaged than their predecessors. Their presence mattered ceremonially more than operationally. Grand viziers and seasoned administrators carried most of the burden. Decisions were filtered through layers of counsel, correspondence, and habit. This made governance slow but surprisingly consistent. Provincial life continued as it had for generations. Village elders mediated minor disputes. Farmers followed agricultural cycles. Taxes were collected. Water systems maintained themselves with regularity. These small rhythms formed the backbone of life in the empire. Minor variations, like a delayed harvest or a flood, were absorbed quietly. People adapted, and the system endured. Urban centers expanded incrementally. Neighborhoods grew, but infrastructure followed more slowly. Streets were patched, fountains repaired, bridges replaced. Daily life demanded attention to these small details, which required more coordination as populations increased. Craftsmen, bakers, and water carriers became essential in maintaining predictable routines. Trade persisted along established routes. Caravans followed the same paths they had for decades, occasionally adjusting for local disturbances. Ports operated on seasonal schedules. Merchants tolerated minor fluctuations in supply and demand because they knew the rhythm would continue tomorrow. Continuity was more valuable than novelty. The military remained both a stabilizing and limiting factor. Janissaries continued to live between soldiering and civilian life. Their training and routines were slower than in earlier centuries, but this created a steady, reliable force. Cavalry and provincial militias managed local security, often using familiar strategies and traditional arrangements. Large-scale campaigns were less frequent, calculated for practicality rather than ambition. Education and scholarship remained conservative. Students memorized established texts and practiced disciplined interpretation. The transmission of knowledge emphasized consistency over innovation. Scholars debated precedent more than discovery. The literary and legal traditions were maintained carefully, with small adjustments only when necessary to align with evolving realities. Religious institutions were central to both social cohesion and personal routine. Prayer times structured the day. Rituals reinforced community identity. Festivals punctuated the year with predictability. Mosques, churches, and synagogues managed their internal affairs under imperial oversight, maintaining a steady rhythm. The empire's bureaucracy grew heavier over time. Each layer introduced a small delay, but also stability. Letters traveled slowly, instructions were reiterated, and officials adapted locally when central guidance arrived late. This system worked imperfectly but reliably. Succession remained a sensitive topic. Princes were carefully educated and monitored. Sudden disruptions were minimized. Advisors managed transitions with caution. Young rulers often inherited well-established patterns, learning slowly that patience was as valuable as decisiveness. Economic life remained grounded in routine. Agricultural production, trade, taxation, and craftsmanship all followed long-established cycles. Markets operated with predictable patterns. Urban consumption was steady. People tolerated minor shortages because overall patterns remained stable. In coastal regions, shipping schedules continued to follow seasonal winds. Maintenance of ships and docks was steady but unspectacular. Sailors and merchants adjusted to minor disruptions, knowing that, like the empire itself, life would continue. Art and architecture followed familiar motifs. New buildings resembled old ones. Decorative innovations were subtle. Continuity was valued more than experimentation. The visual landscape remained reassuringly familiar to inhabitants and visitors alike. Diplomatic activity with European powers increased gradually. Envoys were dispatched. Reports collected. Policy shifted slowly in response to external developments. Engagement was deliberate, carefully measured, and cautious. Natural events continued their quiet disruptions, floods, droughts, fires, but the empire absorbed them with slow, methodical interventions. Reconstruction, relief, and support were provided incrementally. Life adjusted without drama. Daily existence for most subjects remained defined by familiar cycles. Work, prayer, trade, family life, and seasonal tasks persisted. Minor innovations or interruptions were incorporated gradually. Stability was the underlying principle of life in the empire. Chapter 9. Patterns of Quiet Governance. As the 18th century wore on, the Ottoman Empire became increasingly defined by patterns rather than personalities. Sultans came and went, but the machinery of governance hummed along steadily, relying on centuries of habit and protocol. Decisions were rarely urgent. They followed schedules, procedures, and precedent. Surprise was unwelcome, and stability was prized. Provincial administration had by now reached a familiar shape. Governors maintained local order, collected taxes, and mediated disputes. Their authority was tempered by tradition and limited by custom. Most decisions were pragmatic rather than strategic. Officials learned to act slowly, carefully weighing the consequences of minor errors. Bureaucracy, in this sense, was both a constraint and a protective layer for those governing the empire's vast territories. For the common people, life continued with quiet predictability. Farmers tended fields according to established calendars. Villagers negotiated local issues with elders or timar holders. Seasonal rhythms dictated labor and leisure alike. Markets opened, merchants sold, and tradesmen produced goods as they had for generations. Small disruptions occurred, bad harvests, floods, or occasional epidemics, but these were absorbed, not dramatized. Life's continuity mattered more than momentary crises. Urban centers retained a sense of order through repetition. Streets and neighborhoods were structured by habit. Craftsmen followed routines dictated by guild rules. Bakers, blacksmiths, and carpenters carried out daily work without variation unless circumstances demanded it. Commerce was steady, though rarely spectacular. Observers might note the same faces, the same stalls, the same conversations repeated week after week. This quiet consistency reinforced social cohesion. The Janissaries had transformed further. Originally isolated soldiers trained in strict discipline, they were now integrated into urban life. Many held businesses or married locally. Their role was a hybrid of military presence and civic participation. Authority became as much about influence as coercion, and their existence helped stabilize neighborhoods more than it enforced dramatic control. Education maintained traditional structures. Schools emphasized memorization and comprehension of established texts. Scholars debated interpretations, but the scope of inquiry remained bounded by precedent. Practical knowledge was valued more than speculative thought. The goal was a consistent, predictable intellectual culture rather than radical innovation. Religious institutions continued to anchor daily life. Prayer times structured days. Rituals marked weeks and months. Mosques, churches, and synagogues operated within prescribed limits, providing guidance and community structure. Festivals and holy days punctuated ordinary routines, reinforcing the sense of time and order. Military campaigns persisted but were increasingly calculated exercises in endurance. Logistics dominated strategy. Armies moved deliberately. Supply lines were carefully monitored. Battles, when they occurred, were often anticlimactic, emphasizing procedure over heroics. The empire's reach expanded incrementally, rarely with the drama historians tend to emphasize. Chapter 11. The gradual stretch of the empire. As the 19th century approached, the Ottoman Empire had become a system defined by its own scale. Its borders were vast, its population diverse, and its institutions numerous. Governing such a territory required patience, methodical administration, and a careful adherence to precedent. The empire had grown accustomed to slow, steady operations. Change was considered only if it could be absorbed gradually. Sultans remained the symbolic center of authority, though their direct involvement in governance varied. Many relied heavily on grand viziers, ministers, and provincial governors. Decisions were often filtered through several layers of bureaucracy, ensuring that any action taken was deliberate and documented. Speed was sacrificed for consistency. Surprise was discouraged. Provincial governance continued to rely on a mix of central oversight and local autonomy. Governors managed taxes, oversaw local courts, and supervised military obligations. Local notables mediated disputes and ensured compliance with imperial regulations. This layered approach was flexible enough to absorb minor irregularities but rigid enough to maintain overall control. Rural life remained consistent. Farmers worked their lands according to seasonal rhythms. Villagers negotiated minor disputes with elders or timar holders. Taxes were collected regularly. When challenges arose, poor harvests, floods, or epidemics, they were addressed incrementally, often by adjusting obligations rather than imposing sudden changes. Predictability remained the foundation of daily life. Urban centers operated with familiar patterns. Markets opened and closed at scheduled times. Craftsmen followed guild rules. Shops remained in the same locations. Bakers, blacksmiths, and carpenters maintained steady output. Consumers moved within a predictable rhythm, purchasing the same goods and services as previous generations. Familiarity reinforced social cohesion. The Janissaries continued their dual role. Integrated into city life, they maintained order, fulfilled military obligations, and participated in trade. Their evolving presence blurred the lines between military and civilian spheres. Drills, inspections, and deployments were conducted methodically. Spontaneity was avoided. Education remained traditional and structured. Students memorized texts, practiced interpretation, and learned practical administration. Scholarship emphasized mastery over innovation. Libraries, manuscripts, and correspondence maintained continuity, providing a steady transmission of knowledge across generations. Religious institutions anchored community life. Prayer times structured days. Rituals and festivals marked months and seasons. Faith offered guidance, comfort, and a shared framework for behavior. Religious authorities mediated local disputes, reinforced hierarchy, and maintained social norms. Military campaigns persisted, though less frequently and with careful planning. Logistics dominated strategy. Armies moved along established routes. Supply lines were managed meticulously. Engagements were calculated, victories measured, and losses absorbed without panic. The Ottoman approach emphasized persistence over spectacle. Trade networks remained stable but adaptive. Caravans and ports operated on predictable schedules. Merchants responded slowly to global shifts, favoring reliability over rapid gains. Minor disruptions, weather, piracy, or regional unrest, were tolerated and integrated into business practices. The bureaucracy, already substantial, expanded further. Letters, reports, and petitions traveled through multiple offices. Delays were inevitable, but they reinforced structure. Officials exercised judgment when communication lagged, maintaining continuity without deviation from established norms. Court life remained highly ceremonial. Access to the Sultan was carefully managed. Protocol governed interactions. Decisions flowed through layers of advisors and precedent. Ritual and formality replaced immediacy, ensuring that governance remained orderly even when rulers changed. Art and architecture followed traditional motifs. New buildings echoed familiar styles. Minor decorative variations appeared, but continuity dominated. The physical landscape reflected institutional stability and social consistency. Natural events continued to disrupt life occasionally. Fires, floods, and epidemics were absorbed gradually. Relief and reconstruction followed established procedures. Communities adjusted incrementally, maintaining routines wherever possible. By the end of Chapter 11, the Ottoman Empire appears less as a narrative of conquest and more as a system of persistent administration. Its durability is rooted in routine, continuity, and measured adjustment. Daily life, governance, trade, and military activity operate within established rhythms. The empire endures because it has learned to function predictably, quietly, and reliably, allowing life to persist without unnecessary alarm. Chapter 12. Incremental change and quiet adjustments. By the early 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had become a study in slow adaptation. Its institutions were numerous, its bureaucracy layered, and its population vast and diverse. The empire had learned that abrupt change often caused more disruption than it solved, so adjustments were incremental, absorbed over years rather than months. Stability remained the guiding principle. Sultans retained symbolic authority, but the daily operation of the state was managed by ministers, viziers, and provincial governors. Decisions were deliberate, filtered through correspondence, memos, and meetings. Rapid action was rare. Delays were expected and accommodated. Authority flowed through routine rather than personal force. Provincial life remained organized around local intermediaries. Governors ensured tax collection and law enforcement, but relied heavily on village elders and community leaders to mediate disputes. These intermediaries smoothed interactions between the state and ordinary people. Their role was informal yet essential, reinforcing predictability in everyday life. Rural populations continued long-standing cycles of agriculture. Planting, tending, and harvesting occurred according to seasonal rhythms. Livestock were cared for according to long-established practices. Disruptions like droughts or floods were addressed gradually. Tax adjustments, delayed obligations, and local aid absorbed shocks without creating panic. Familiarity with these routines gave villagers a sense of control over their lives, even under imperial oversight. Urban centers retained their habitual rhythms. Markets, workshops, and guilds operated on predictable schedules. Artisans repeated familiar tasks. Apprentices observed and absorbed practices that had been established for decades. Consumers purchased familiar goods. The city itself remained an environment of continuity where deviation was rare and noticeable. The Janissaries, while still formally part of the military, continued their integration into civilian life. Many married, owned property, and engaged in commerce. Their military duties were performed with routine discipline. The line between soldier and citizen had blurred, creating a stabilizing presence in urban neighborhoods. Their predictability contributed to overall social order. Education remained conservative and methodical. Students memorized texts, practiced legal and religious interpretation, and learned administrative skills. Scholarship emphasized adherence to precedent. Libraries preserved manuscripts carefully, and scholars corresponded with peers slowly but consistently. New ideas were cautiously considered and often absorbed only when compatible with tradition. Religious institutions reinforced social norms and structured time. Prayer schedules segmented the day. Festivals marked the passing of months and seasons. Religious leaders mediated local disputes and maintained community order. Their presence ensured continuity, providing guidance and stability within both urban and rural settings. Military campaigns became rarer, more calculated, and focused on maintenance rather than conquest. Troop movements, supply chains, and fortifications were carefully managed. Engagements were cautious, measured, and largely predictable. Success was defined less by dramatic victories than by the maintenance of boundaries and the persistence of order. Trade networks adjusted gradually to global changes. Caravans and ships followed familiar routes. Merchants adapted slowly to new markets and disruptions. Profit was secondary to reliability. Systems of credit, storage, and supply were emphasized over speculation. Minor losses were absorbed, minor gains accumulated, and overall continuity was preserved. The bureaucracy expanded steadily. Layers of officials handled petitions, correspondence, and implementation of policy. Letters traveled through offices slowly, requiring patience. Officials exercised judgment locally when communication lagged, maintaining functional consistency. The system prioritized endurance over speed. Court life remained ritualized. Access to the Sultan was mediated through multiple channels. Decisions were filtered through advisors and precedent. Silence and ceremony governed interactions, reinforcing the perception of order. Even small deviations from protocol were noticed and corrected. Stability was preserved above all. Art, architecture, and public works followed established patterns. New structures reflected traditional forms, with only minor stylistic variations. Familiarity in design reinforced the social and administrative order. People recognized and trusted their built environment, which mirrored the predictability of governance. Natural disruptions, fires, floods, droughts, epidemics, were absorbed gradually. The empire responded with incremental relief, reconstruction, and support. Communities adjusted slowly, maintaining continuity wherever possible. By the close of Chapter 12, the Ottoman Empire demonstrates its resilience through methodical adaptation. Change exists, but it is measured, slow, and absorbed quietly into existing routines. Life continues within predictable rhythms. Stability is reinforced daily through repetition, continuity, and careful management. The empire endures because it has mastered the art of small adjustments, ensuring that the familiar persists across generations. Chapter 13: The Weight of Custom. By the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire had become an intricate web of custom, habit, and routine. Its scale was immense, its population diverse, and its administration dense. Governing it required adherence to precedent and careful management of expectations. Sudden changes were rare, avoided whenever possible, and only undertaken when absolutely necessary. Stability, above all, was the empire's guiding principle. The Sultan continued as the symbolic heart of authority, but much of the day-to-day governance rested on grand viziers, ministers, and provincial governors. Decisions were deliberate, filtered through multiple layers of correspondence, reports, and counsel. This created a slow but reliable rhythm of administration. Delays were anticipated. Immediate action was unusual. The empire moved like a vast machine, measured, heavy, and steady. Provincial administration relied on local intermediaries to maintain order. Village elders and community leaders mediated disputes, coordinated tax collection, and managed minor conflicts. Their role was informal but crucial, allowing the central state to function without micromanaging. This arrangement encouraged local continuity while reinforcing imperial authority in a predictable manner. Rural life remained dominated by long-standing cycles of agriculture. Fields were sown, tended, and harvested according to seasonal rhythms. Livestock were cared for with traditional practices. Disruptions such as droughts, floods, or pestilence were managed incrementally. Taxes adjusted, obligations postponed, aid distributed slowly. Villagers lived within these frameworks and relied on routine to maintain a sense of control. Urban centers continued their habitual patterns. Markets opened and closed predictably. Craftsmen followed guild rules, repeating familiar tasks learned over decades. Shops retained their locations. Consumers purchased goods with steady expectation. Familiarity reinforced social cohesion and reduced uncertainty. Change was noticeable and often unwelcome. The Janissaries, still present but increasingly integrated into urban society, balanced military obligations with civilian life. Many owned businesses, married, or participated in local governance. Their dual role stabilized neighborhoods, providing authority without spectacle. Routine training, inspections, and deployments preserved discipline while accommodating civilian responsibilities. Education and scholarship remained conservative. Students memorized established texts, practiced interpretation, and learned administrative and religious duties. Original thought was secondary to mastery of tradition. Libraries and manuscripts were carefully maintained. Correspondence with scholars elsewhere was deliberate and measured. Incremental intellectual exchange occurred cautiously, often mediated by social norms and institutional expectations. Religious institutions continued to anchor community life. Prayer structured the day. Rituals and festivals punctuated the year. Religious authorities mediated disputes, reinforced social norms, and maintained order. Their presence provided predictability and comfort, particularly during periods of change or disruption. Military campaigns were increasingly calculated and cautious. Troop movements, supply lines, and fortifications were meticulously organized. Engagements were methodical rather than spontaneous. Success was measured in persistence, boundary maintenance, and logistical reliability rather than dramatic victories. Trade remained steady but adapted slowly to changing global conditions. Merchants followed familiar routes, adjusted incrementally to new markets, and absorbed minor losses while accumulating small gains. Reliability took precedence over speculative profit. Established systems of storage, credit, and supply remained crucial. Bureaucracy grew steadily heavier. Multiple offices processed petitions, correspondence, and implementation of policy. Letters traveled slowly, and decisions were delayed, but this reinforced stability. Officials exercised discretion locally when communication lagged, preserving the functioning of the system despite temporal gaps. Court life remained ceremonial and tightly controlled. Access to the Sultan was mediated through layers of protocol. Decisions were filtered through advisors and precedent. Ceremony reinforced order, and even minor deviations from protocol were corrected. Predictability was paramount. Architecture and public works reflected continuity. New structures adhered to traditional styles, with minor decorative variations. Familiar forms reinforced the social and administrative order, making the physical environment an extension of routine and governance. Natural disruptions, fires, floods, droughts, epidemics, were managed incrementally. Reconstruction, relief, and adaptation followed slow, methodical processes. Communities adjusted gradually, integrating disturbances into daily life without altering overall patterns. By the end of Chapter 13, the Ottoman Empire is defined not by conquest or dramatic reform but by the weight of custom. Its durability arises from predictable patterns, adherence to precedent, and methodical management. The empire persists because daily life, administration, and social structures operate within established rhythms, absorbing shocks quietly and ensuring continuity across generations. Chapter 14: Adaptation without urgency. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had settled into a state where adaptation occurred slowly, deliberately, and without urgency. The world beyond its borders was changing rapidly. Industrialization in Europe, shifting trade networks, and evolving military technologies, but the empire responded incrementally. Change was integrated gradually, absorbed into familiar routines, and measured against the principle of maintaining stability. Sultans continued to symbolize authority, yet much of the day-to-day governance fell to experienced ministers, grand viziers, and provincial administrators. Policies were filtered through layers of bureaucracy, correspondence, and discussion. Rapid decisions were rare. Procedures dominated. Predictability mattered more than innovation. Provincial governance relied heavily on local intermediaries. Village elders, timar holders, and community notables coordinated tax collection, mediated disputes, and maintained order. Their authority was informal but essential, providing continuity in daily life while allowing the central government to function efficiently. Minor adjustments were made locally rather than imposed suddenly from Istanbul. Rural populations maintained agricultural cycles established over centuries. Crops were planted, tended, and harvested according to seasonal rhythms. Livestock management followed familiar routines. Disruptions such as droughts, floods, or disease were managed incrementally, taxes adjusted, obligations postponed, relief delivered slowly. Stability was preserved by maintaining the habitual structure of daily life. Urban life remained predictable. Markets, workshops, and guilds continued their long-standing practices. Craftsmen repeated familiar tasks. Shops opened at consistent hours. Consumers relied on predictable availability of goods. Continuity reinforced social cohesion, reducing uncertainty even as minor economic fluctuations occurred. The Janissaries, long integrated into civilian life, continued to balance military duties with commerce and family obligations. They stabilized neighborhoods, performing inspections and drills on predictable schedules. Their presence ensured order without spectacle. Education and scholarship emphasized preservation over novelty. Students memorized religious and legal texts, practiced interpretation, and learned administrative procedures. Libraries, manuscripts, and correspondence preserved knowledge methodically. Intellectual exchange with Europe and other regions occurred, but adoption was cautious and incremental. Tradition guided adaptation. Religious institutions structured both private and public life. Prayer marked the day. Festivals and holy days marked months and seasons. Religious leaders mediated disputes, reinforced social norms, and maintained community cohesion. Familiar rituals offered reassurance, particularly during periods of incremental change. Military campaigns were increasingly cautious, logistically focused, and rare. Troops moved deliberately along known routes. Supply lines were carefully managed. Engagements prioritized sustainability over dramatic achievement. Success was measured by stability, persistence, and order rather than conquest. Trade adapted gradually to global shifts. Merchants adjusted routes and practices incrementally. Reliability was prioritized over rapid profit. Systems of credit, storage, and logistics ensured continuity, allowing minor losses and gains to be absorbed without destabilizing commerce. The bureaucracy continued to expand. Layers of officials processed petitions, correspondence, and policy implementation. Delays were accepted as normal. Local discretion compensated for slow communication. The system functioned effectively through consistency rather than speed or innovation. Court life remained ceremonial, governed by protocol and precedent. Access to the Sultan was structured. Decisions passed through advisors and multiple approvals. Ceremony and formalities reinforced authority and predictability. Deviations were corrected, ensuring stability at the center. Architecture and public works adhered to traditional forms. New buildings reflected established styles with subtle variations. Physical spaces mirrored administrative and social continuity, reinforcing familiarity and trust in daily life. Natural events, fires, floods, droughts, epidemics, were absorbed gradually. Relief, reconstruction, and adaptation followed methodical patterns. Communities adjusted incrementally, preserving routine. By the end of Chapter 14, the Ottoman Empire demonstrates resilience through slow, deliberate adaptation. Change occurs, but it is measured, predictable, and absorbed quietly. The empire endures because it integrates new conditions into established rhythms, prioritizes stability, and allows daily life to continue largely uninterrupted. In its persistence lies its quiet strength.